information from a higher perspective. Your host, Harry Wilkinson. Hello, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. My name is Harry Wilkinson, and this is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world of politics, international news, technology, the environment, anything and everything that we hear about throughout our busy week, that we interact with, that affects us in particular ways, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective. That higher perspective being just taking that step back and looking at the outer world, all of those things that are happening around us, differently. From a perspective of being not so much above it, but beyond it, in a way. We are talking about the idea of that we exist outside of our physical selves. Basically, that's the idea, that there is more to our world, to ourselves, to everything than just the physical that we deal with in our mundane world. In fact, that physical is simply rather superficial and not indicative of the truth of who and what we are. The truth of who and what we are lies in a higher realm. That's my perspective. So when we deal with stories from our ever-expanding universe of communication and information, whether it's from the cable networks or from our new media, from our social media, as we become bombarded with information that can sometimes feel toxic, I think it's a very important wellness tool to understand how to take that step back and to look at these situations from a different perspective. The realization that none of this is really the truth can take a long time, and I think it's in a way very personal. It's something that you have to come to, even if you understand it on a intellectual level, or even somewhat on a philosophical level. It doesn't really sink in until you have a realization of it that touches the deepest part of you, a true understanding of how things in the world get in the world, and how, while we participate in those things in the world, and we should also understand that our participation in these things is also part of an illusion, or a game, if you will. Think of it as a virtual reality game that feels extraordinarily real, with pain and fear and loss and sadness and all of those things that at the highest level of our beings are not the truth of us. but we experience them, we get to experience them in sort of a totality of this human existence that we've created. And I believe we create it to have those experiences. To be, to use a very overused phrase, and I'm sorry about that, but it does have its relevance, to be in the world, but not of it. In fact, sometimes I think it ought to be the other way around, to be of the world, but not in it. So from a metaphysical standpoint, which is, where I come from, at the highest level, we are creating everything that we experience. And we create it to have these experiences. And so by going within these experiences and recognizing the truth about them, it empowers us incredibly. It certainly can change any situation that you might be in, or that you feel discomfort about, but you don't go in with the idea of changing anything. You go into it to feel the experience and then to recognize the truth of it. And this is done through meditation, through mindfulness, which we talk a lot about on this show, through just being in the moment, to use another really overused term. But in any event, not to get too heady here, or too woo-woo, you don't have to come from any of those perspectives to get something out of this show, I hope, because we talk about different ways of, looking at the news of the day, and we also talk about breakthroughs in areas of science and in spirituality that and wellness, which I think can be helpful to people, and I think is, regardless of what your belief system might be, what religion you might practice, or not practice at all. This is a show that I believe is open to anyone and everyone, that you can get something from, whether you're an atheist or a religious believer. Some of your belief systems may stop you or block you from appreciating what we talk about here, and that's understandable if you have religious beliefs that maybe pull you back from hearing about certain things, or if you have a sort of aversion to anything that has to remotely to do with something spiritual, or that calls itself spiritual. You may not get a lot out of it, but you may get something. So I hope you those who have maybe some issues with my philosophy that I talk about, at least some of these topics that we're talking about may be helpful. And what we're talking about, and have been for the past couple of weeks, is how to change the mind, changing minds. And in particular, we're talking about the rise and resurgence of research using, for lack of a better term, psychedelics, such as LSD, such as mescaline, and even the psilocybin, the magic mushrooms kinds of things. Peyote is also one of those types of drugs, although it's not being discussed particularly in this context. What kicked this off, by the way, is an article in a subsequent book by a gentleman by the name of Michael Pollan, who has a book about the new research that's being done using these psychedelic drugs. And over the past couple of episodes, we've been talking about the history of these drugs and the research that used to be done until they were sort of banned by society because of a lot of horror stories that were built around it, and how now it's becoming part of at least scientific research, if not being used and being used medicinally, if not being used recreationally, because there still is a lot of fear around the use of these drugs, because of these stories that have sort of circulated around the use of things like LSD, the idea that you go crazy and lose your mind. These things have happened. I mean, these stories come about because of incidents that have occurred, but they were incidents that were rare, but became so much a part of the storytelling around it that people began to think that, well, if you take this drug, you will lose your mind. That's not the case, and never has been. It can, for people who do have, issues with mental illness, particularly issues with schizophrenia or delusions, it can certainly trigger those, and it would, of course, be responsible for them not to be used with people who have those illnesses. But for the average person, while you might have a religious experience or spiritual experience or a mystical experience using these drugs, you aren't going to go crazy, but you might lose your mind. And I think that's what people were really scared of and are still scared of. And when I say lose your mind, I don't mean it in the sense of having a psychotic break, going crazy. I mean losing particularly that part of the mind that is locked into the ordinary, if you will, that is locked into an accepting of society and its particular belief systems, and mostly the ego. That's what it's really locked into. It's the sense of self. It's the sense of this is how things are. This is who I am, and that's all there is. Mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, and the experiences that people have talked about, having taken these drugs in clinical environments, talk about the dissolution of the self, a sense of expansion, transcendence, if you will, and becoming part of something greater. That's losing yourself. That's losing your mind. That's losing your ego sense, in a way. We talked about this quite a while, maybe a year or two ago, when we were talking about the experience